Hello everybody, I'm here today with the Zephyrus G16. I want to give you my overall thoughts of having used this machine as my only dedicated machine and daily driving this for the last 3 months or so. I've been living the laptop life with the Zephyrus G16 here, and I want to give you my thoughts on the overall performance, the thermals, and of course the noise and temperatures from this device. Particularly for those of you who are looking to pick up the Zephyrus G16, either the 2023 model with the Core i5, the Core i9 185H from Intel and the NVIDIA GPUs, or the AMD Ryzen 9 with the Zen 5 CPUs with the RTX 4000 GPUs still. It's going to be the same things that apply to either last year's 2023 models. This applies both for the Zephyrus and for the ProArt models because they use the same thin and light chassis here. So the nice thing to say about this chassis, it is quite thin. It's just under 4.5 pounds and it basically packs a lot of power. It's a very compelling option. The product itself is actually quite something. So if you look at it here, it's actually nice and thin. First things first, before we get this powered on and I talk about what my overall impressions are and the challenges I've had with this device is, if we look at this, the bottom panels here, and this is plastic by the way, only the chassis itself is CNC milled aluminum, but the bottom here is actually plastic, which isn't bad necessarily. However, there are some concerns with this. One, if you look at the way that this panel is created, you can see one fan is here, one fan is here, and I believe there's another smaller fan inside somewhere. So there's 3 fans inside this laptop here. But the main challenges are because these are such thin grills, and half of these in the center are actually plugged or blocked. So you only have a set of grills here, a set of grills here, and a few here in the center, I believe, where the center fan is, to draw in air to cool this device. When you have an RTX 4070, which can draw up to 100 watts itself, and the Core i9 185H is certainly no slouch, it can draw just as much wattage at the high end as the RTX 4070, you have a recipe for a bad time here. But I want to talk about how ASUS has implemented this solution, what I believe are some of the challenges for those of you considering this device, either 2023 or the 2024 models, and give you my impressions with this device over the last several months. And as far as workloads are concerned, I said I've been putting this through the ringer. I've been using this for gaming, of course, game streaming as well. So while I'm gaming, I'm streaming from my laptop dedicated without any other device. And I've also been using this, of course, for content creation. So all of this footage that you see here is edited, bundled, and basically done from here. So this has been my mainstay. I don't have a desktop. I decided to live the laptop life for the last 3 months, and this has been my driver. So first things first, I want to talk about the software here. ASUS Armor Crate is a software that's used to administer this laptop, and overall I would say it works well, but there's a lot of stuff going on here that I don't think necessarily needs to be there. I would love for ASUS to please slim this down. I know you want to make it look gamery and you have flashy RGB colors, which is great, but please simplify this. That said, when you boot up the machine initially when it's installed, and when you boot up the machine, typically it's going to go into performance mode. So there's 3 different modes here that are defined. There's more than that. There's a Windows mode, which I believe lets Windows manage your power profiles. I wouldn't recommend that. There's a silent mode, which basically turns everything down to heavily throttles everything. If I go to silent, it drops down the CPU frequency below 2 gigahertz. It also drops down the screen's display brightness to really preserve that battery life. I wouldn't recommend that anybody use this mode for any kind of daily workflow. If you're reading or just maybe streaming a movie, perhaps this mode is of use to you. Typically, you want to leave it in the performance mode. This will boost up the CPU frequency to about 3 gigahertz or higher, and you're going to be able to get that fan and power to that GPU as well. In addition, even though there's NVIDIA Optimus on board here, it's not set up by default. You'll have to tab over, go into here and select the optimized mode, which is where NVIDIA will use Optimus to select that GPU based on the application that you're running on this device. If you use standard mode, it also kind of works. It's the MS hybrid hybrid mode that is managed by Windows. I don't like this mode because sometimes it seems there's a freeze to the display for a few seconds before it switches into the display mode. Optimized on this implementation and this particular laptop has been the smoothest. No judder, no lockup, no freezing. I was experiencing such behaviors on other laptops that I tested last year and this year. Now, let's get back to the performance. As I mentioned, there's 3 fans in this device here. We're starting off with the performance mode in ASUS Armor Crate. This is the default mode that the device likes to boot to. And when you initially get this laptop, it'll be running in performance mode. That said, we're going to fire up our Furmark benchmark here. And this is just a demonstration. This isn't a typical workload, what you'd be doing daily, but we'll demonstrate a little bit further what happens to this device as thermal limits of this chassis are reached. So we're going to run this at QHD resolution, even though this is a 16 by 10, 2560 by 1600 display. This is the closest we can get to that resolution. I've got some numbers on here on the display so you can see what the thermals are going to look like and what the power levels are. So initially, when we boot from a cold boot, there's no heat generated in this chassis. It's nice and cool, running at around the ambient temperature of the room. In performance mode, we start at around 80 watts on that GPU, and we can see here that the temperatures are starting to climb quickly. ASUS does delay the ramp up of those fans. You can see right now the device is pretty much silent. There's very little audible noise, fan noise that's coming from this device. And ASUS doesn't start to throttle up the fans until you start to reach above 80 degrees. So we can see here now that we've reached the thermal throttling temperature of that GPU right up against that 87 degrees Celsius limit, and we're getting 70 watts still. We'll start to see that certainly starts to drop down very, very quickly here. The CPU is also getting up there 90 plus degrees in terms of temperature with only about 20 watts of power to that CPU. So these are very, very power hungry components. That CPU and the GPU in this chassis can be a significant challenge to manage. We'll talk about what happens now as it starts to ramp up. You can see here that we're still getting very good frame rates. Our 1% lows are very good. Our frame times are still excellent. That said, we're still seeing about 70, 80 watts of power roughly on that GPU. We'll pause a moment, come back in a few minutes, and I'll basically update you guys on what happens to the power levels here. Alright, so we can see here after a few minutes elapsed of running this test here with the Furmark, I'll tab over to our task manager here, and I want to show you what kind of load we're getting on this device. So the CPU here, we're sitting at around 15% usage, between 10 to 15%. The GPU here is fully loaded. The 3D rendering of our GPU is being consumed here at about 90% plus percent. And copy, which means the data transfer here. It's very nice to see these level of statistics within Windows without having to resort to other third-party tools. About 5 minutes in, this is the performance we're seeing. We're still getting about 75 watts roughly on that GPU, but it is hitting that thermal throttle temperature, so we're not getting any dynamic boost here whatsoever. This is entirely just power levels running to that GPU, since it can boost up to 80 watts without any additional dynamic boost applied. That said, let's take some temperature readings here, and we'll also give you some sound readings of how this device sounds running at this performance level. So around the WASD keys here, we can see that we're sitting at a nice and cool 33.2 degrees. That's nothing really to rave about. It's actually quite comfortable, and you can game at this temperature on the surface of the laptop itself for hours. It does, however, get hot near the hinge of this display. That's where most of the heat is generated, and the heat is exhausted here from the screen vent. So if we take a reading here, closer to the hinge, we'll start to see that it's actually closer to about 50 degrees, which is quite a bit warmer, but certainly you're not going to be touching there in normal operation or gameplay, so that's, I think, acceptable. Next thing we'll do is we'll take some audible readings to see what the noise levels are like. We'll push this a little bit back so we're exhibiting what a normal seating distance would look like. So at ear level, what is the noise we're hearing from this? You can certainly game at this level for quite a while without having any performance issues. And we'll swap up from the performance into the turbo mode, which is the next higher level mode. We saw that with performance mode, our CPU was running around 2.5, maybe 2.7, 2.8 gigahertz, somewhere under that range, under the 3 gigahertz mark for sure. Now we see that as soon as we bump up the performance mode to turbo, our CPU is trying to hit close to that 4 gigahertz mark and hold there. We'll see that our power levels now are definitely changing. Our GPU is being throttled a little bit further down because, of course, we're thermal throttling, and also we're taking some of that power and distributing it over to that CPU. We're getting about 35, sometimes even close to 40 watts on that CPU, and we can see now that the CPU is reaching 100 degrees Celsius, which is pretty much its thermal throttling temperature as well. The fan noise has also gone up. I'm sure you can visibly hear that. We'll take a reading in just a moment. I'll let this run for a moment here. We can see that somehow the GPU has now decided to bump itself up to 100 watts. I do not understand these inconsistencies in power levels, or why they happen or what causes them, but this is the behavior that I'm seeing. I'm demonstrating this to you raw, and these are exactly the things I've seen in about 3 months of usage with this laptop. There has been 1 or 2 BIOS updates. I assume ASUS is trying to stabilize this laptop. Of course, the same design and chassis on the Pro Art series as well as the Zephyrus G16 series for 2024, so same type of tricks would apply there as well. But you can see here that we are getting 100 watts on that GPU, but we're certainly hitting the thermal throttle temperature on that GPU, and the CPU is sitting at 83 degrees. I think that's pretty acceptable. We can see here now though that the CPU has throttled itself all the way down to about 18 watts, so under 20 watts for sure. The fans are louder, so now GPU is being preferred in terms of power distribution. The laptop and ASUS's BIOS at this turbo mode is pushing as much power it can to that GPU and throttling down that CPU, because that's the bias here for this particular mode. That said, if we look at our GPU usage, we're still getting 100% nearly on our GPU usage for 3D rendering and some slight other usage here. Our CPU is sitting only at around 15 to 16%, between 10 and 15% roughly, and we're sitting right around 2.2 gigahertz, kind of bouncing back and forth there. Let's check the temperatures now while this is running. So again, we'll start with the WASD keys first. So the WASD keys now are sitting at roughly around 26 degrees, which is nice and cool because the fans of course are spinning much louder. Next thing we'll do is we'll take a temperature reading around the hinge again, because as I said, it draws air through the bottom and exhausts it near the hinge here up along the panel itself. 41 degrees Celsius. Again, since you're not going to be touching at that area near the hinge in typical use and operation, I think that's fairly acceptable here. Next thing we'll do is take some reading of the audible and the noise levels here. So we'll push this right back, and we're seeing about 52 decibels, roughly 50 to 52 decibels of noise at ear level in the turbo mode here, with the fan spinning nicely. So there you have it. So in turbo mode, it's certainly able to maintain these temps. I'm getting about 100 watts on that GPU, about 20 watts or under 20 watts, 15 watts roughly on that CPU. CPU sitting at 83 degrees, the GPU sitting at 87 degrees, about 52 decibels of noise, and the temperatures are up there. And finally, what we'll do is now we'll swap over to our Armory Crate again. So the last mode here that I want to demonstrate is called the manual mode. So in this mode, you're able to affect the CPU, the GPU, and the system profile in terms of the fan speed, so you can draw the fan curves or choose from 3 presets. The GPU, you can adjust the base clocks, apply an overclock if you like, of course set the thermal target temperature for thermal throttling, and you can adjust the GPU power levels as well. There's 5 different levels here that are predefined: 55, 60, 65, 75, and 85 watts. So let's swap over to our manual mode here. What I've done is I've adjusted the PL1 for the CPU to be 28 watts and the long-term PL2 to be 40 watts. So that means we're not going to go over 40 watts in terms of the power that's pushed to that CPU, excuse me. The GPU, I've removed all overclocks. I've left it at the default levels. The thermal target is all the way up to 87 degrees, so we want as much power to be drawn out from that GPU as possible. And the GPU power level is 85 watts, which means with the added dynamic boost, we should be able to get 100 to 105 watts of power and performance out of that RTX 4070 in here. And for system, I've only changed the fan curves here to basically throttle up immediately and to draw the fans and to make them run at full blast, so we can get maximum cooling potential from this mode. So we'll swap over here now. When you do so, ASUS gives you this warning that if something is damaged, they're not responsible. That's fine. Hit yes. And when we switch over here, we'll see now that the situation starts to change a little bit, because of course, as I said, I've changed some of the performance settings in the manual mode. I'm actually pushing some more power to the CPU, so we can put those frame rates up with those higher clock rates. And 80 to 90 watts generally will give you the most performance you can get out of this 4070 GPU without really starving the CPU of data and dropping down your frame rates here. So that said, the fans really ramp up now to max speeds. So at ear level, we're getting actually a little bit higher. It's about 56 decibels of noise. This is a nice soothing sound. It's not too loud. I'll put my microphone up to the device so you can hear closer to what the fan noise actually sounds like. I think it's tolerable, and you will generally be able to tune it out without even a pair of headphones, since these speakers are excellent speakers for laptops. And now let's take some temperature readings around the WAS keys and of course along the hinge to see at manual mode. So surprisingly, but also unsurprisingly, I love this device for the fact that the keyboard stays nice and cool, even this mode. And we've been running now for about 20 minutes this Furmark benchmark. We're seeing about 27 degrees around the WAS keys. So certainly an enjoyable surface temperature for a long gaming session. All right, so those fans are spinning at full blast, but we can see about 40 degrees along the hinge there. You know, certainly those fans have the capacity to cool this device, but it needs to be taken into consideration. You may have to do a little bit of tuning here to get this to not throttle, but we're seeing about 52 Celsius max in terms of the temperatures along the hinge. But since you won't be touching in this area in normal operation, I think that is fairly acceptable. Looking at our task manager again, we'll see that the CPU is being utilized under 20%, so lots of room on that CPU. It's kind of being starved of data. That GPU, of course, is being pushed to 100%. What we'll do now is load this up with both a CPU and a GPU workload, and we'll see how this fares in comparison. Okay, so now here we are. I'm going to fire up. I've got GPU load running in the background using Furmark. I'm going to load up the CPU as well. This is Prime 95. We're going to do some large FFTs here. Let it run here, and we'll start to see in our task manager that the CPU also jumps up immediately to about 60+%. That means there's lots of capacity on this CPU actually to do lots of work. If you're doing CPU only tasks, you have plenty of power here with these Core 9 Ultra 185H CPUs. So we can now see we're getting about 65% usage on our CPU. It's certainly spiked up the usage levels here. GPU still pinned at about 100 degrees and 100% usage. Sorry, 100% usage on the 3D loads here, and we'll see that we're still getting about 90 watts of power to that GPU and about 28 watts of power to that CPU. Unfortunately, in the manual mode, you're not able to draw the CPU down below 28 watts of power. So what I think we'll do here instead is just swap over to the turbo mode, where it is able to push the CPU clocks lower so it can push more power to that GPU. So we'll come back here, we'll let this run for another few minutes, we'll come back and see how this handles the power and also the heat that's being soaked into this device now. As you can see, the fans have ramped down in turbo mode. So this is one of the typical complaints I have for this, is the fan levels are inconsistent. Swapping between the modes without a restart of your device is also inconsistent. You get this very strange behavior. Let's see how this fares in just a moment here. After about 30 minutes of letting this soak in, we can see here that the temperatures are still doing okay, power levels are still well, but because this is artificial workloads, what I want to demonstrate now is a real scenario, which is with OBS in the background, streaming to YouTube, playing a game such as Dragon Age Veilguard, and we'll see how this fares in the performance, or excuse me, in the turbo mode, since that's the highest mode that can give us the maximum wattage to that GPU and the lowest wattage, of course, to that CPU. And we'll demonstrate here how that type of a workload performs when you have both CPU and GPU loaded almost to the max in this device. I've got this in the turbo mode using the Armory Crate. We're running at about 3700 megahertz on that CPU. I have my OBS up. I'm streaming over to YouTube. I have a YouTube stream running live. And what we'll do now is we'll use our EA app to fire up Dragon Age the Veilguard, and we'll demonstrate what kind of load this puts on this device and why gaming plus streaming, or any combined workload where you're fully stressing the CPU and the GPU, is really going to be a challenge for this device. Alright, so as we can see here, as we start out in the game, we're getting close to about where we started around 70 watts, and you saw there was a dip because we're hitting right up to that the thermal throttle temperature, excuse me, of the GPU. As we can see here, we're getting some very strange flickering. The GPU is certainly thermal throttling here. I do not understand what this flickering is, if it's either with the driver. I've used DDU, the device driver uninstaller, to multiple times uninstall the NVIDIA drivers, installed them from scratch using safe mode. I've also done all of my Windows updates. I've updated the game as well to see what the issue is. But this is one of the things I'm experiencing perhaps in this particular game. Maybe it's an issue with this engine, or this just needs an update. So this is certainly one issue here. Let me alt tab out here to the task manager, and I want to demonstrate here. So if you look at our GPU here, it's lit up in pretty much every area. The GPU memory is being fully utilized. The 3D rendering is being utilized. The copy mode is being utilized as well as the video encode. About 40% of the video encode engine is being utilized to stream this video at 2K resolution over to YouTube, and the CPU was pretty much 100% pinned while the gameplay is in action. So let's swap back here and we'll monitor this and play a little bit further. Hopefully we'll get some stable gameplay. Nope. In this case, it's going to just throw a DirectX error at us and crash. So this is one of the things I'm experiencing lately with this game. And by the way, if some of you are concerned that it's just Dragon Age the Veilguard, let me fire up here Star Wars Outlaws and I'll demonstrate that this isn't an issue that's pinned or particular to one game. Now, my game has totally crashed. The graphics driver has crashed. All right, here we are now back. This is Star Wars Outlaws. So right now we're running in the turbo mode as I was just demonstrating in Dragon Age the Veilguard. That game kept crashing, saying that the driver has crashed. That's certainly not the case here. This game is running well. We're getting about 100 watts onto that GPU, but you can see here that it's hitting that thermal throttle temperature of 87 degrees. So it's just going to be a few moments here before this thing really cranks down the wattage to half on that GPU, and you'll get a very steady frame rate, and it's just going to be a mess. It's going to be basically unplayable around 20 frames per second, down from about 80 FPS that we're getting right now in medium setting mode. So while this is running, let me alt tab over to our task manager here. We'll take a look at the CPU. So this game is more GPU heavily dependent. As we can see here, the GPU memory usage of 8 gigs, fully maxed out, guys. So if you're looking for an 8 gigabyte GPU for your choice in 2024, going into 2025, bad idea. You should at least be looking at 12 gigs of RAM. This is going to become more and more common as games start to use more and more GPU memory here. In addition, we've got our video encode running because this is streaming live to YouTube. So about 40% of the video encode engines are being dedicated to streaming this game over to YouTube. And 3D rendering is about 70% here, with about 50% or so roughly load on the CPU. So this game isn't quite as taxing on this machine as Dragon Age the Veilguard is, so it will vary from game to game. But let's play here for a few minutes. I want you guys to see the power levels drop because this is something that's very interesting to see, and you have to catch it when it happens. Otherwise, you're basically going to miss it in the blink of an eye. So we'll jump down here. By the way, are you guys playing any of these games? Have you finished them? Let me know what your thoughts are in the comments below on this particular laptop for gaming. Is this something you want to pick up more light, thin and light, or are you more interested in a very heavy duty, powerful, very high-end laptop such as the Scar G16, which is a behemoth with a 4080? Certainly a totally different spec as opposed to this laptop here. This is more thin and light, kind of a do-it-all. Alright, so here we are. We're still getting about 90 watts of power on that GPU, so fairly good performance. Frame times are good, and frame rates are good as well. If we jump in here, I'll quickly show the settings. So as you guys can see what I'm running here. I'm running in a windowed mode. DLS is on, frame generation is on. That means we're using most of the GPU's capacity. And if we look at our graphics settings here, I'm running in the high preset with all of this stuff is on, and I believe if you go to advanced graphics, some of the ray trace lighting, yeah, so there is some ray trace lighting going on here, but of course in the high preset these are all set to low, very low, or medium. It's a mixed bag here, so I'll leave that there. We can crank this up to ultra, but I believe it's going to max out the GPU's VRAM. Let's keep these settings. And let's see how our frame rate fares now with ultra settings. So it looks like no change. We're running at about 90 degrees Celsius on that CPU and about 87 degrees, which is basically thermal throttle temperature on the GPU. The only thing I want to mention here that's different from the behavior that I was seeing when it was heavily thermal throttling is the ambient temperature. Let's take some thermal temperatures across the WASD keys here for you. Still nothing really to complain about 31 degrees Celsius. I think that's very respectable and certainly a comfortable temperature to game with the keyboard and the keyboard deck of this device. And next, if we'll take a temperature reading across the seam here where the hot air is exhausted onto the display and upward, this is a little bit hotter. We're getting about 46 degrees on that hinge area there, but of course because you're not going to be touching that in normal operation, it's totally acceptable. We'll take some readings here of the noise levels. So in turbo mode, about 52 decibels of noise here from this device. The fans are ramped up. You can certainly hear them. They're very audible, but it's a nice, calm whooshing sound. It's nothing that's going to be too distracting or it's going to overpower if you turn on the speakers, for example. And we'll demonstrate that here quickly, just a moment, by blasting these speakers at full volume. So you can see here that the sound gets very loud. It easily overpowers. Even the ambient noise from the game is overpowering the speakers. You can certainly have a very good gameplay experience here with just the built-in speakers alone. This is at 6 speakers, one of the best I've heard in any laptop. Was one of the reasons why I picked up this laptop as well. And of course, we'll turn the volume down now and we'll show you how the performance sustains over the next few minutes of gameplay. Whoops, and there we go. So this is what I wanted to demonstrate. And luckily we're able to show this here. So the power level has dropped, it thermal throttled, it dropped down to about 45 watts on that GPU. And now you can see we're getting this odd screen tearing and really weird artifacting that's making the gameplay almost impossible. I mean, you can still play if you want to be very hard-headed about it, but it's certainly not going to be an enjoyable experience. And of course, you'll wait for the power levels to throttle back up, but this stuttering now won't go away until you quit the game and have to restart. So this is the same thing that I've been experiencing when you load both. And let's hop over quickly to our task manager. We can see here our CPU was pinned at 100% usage. Our GPU was also at about 63% usage, but our GPU memory is fully exhausted here at 8 gigabytes, and the video encode here was also starting to hit 100%, which was causing further stuttering because the power levels dropped, thus the utilization went all the way up. That is my assumption here for the GPU. So something to take note here if you're going to buy this for gaming plus game streaming or anywhere where you're recording gameplay and also gaming at the same time, because 1, you have that VRAM limit that you'll be running into. 2, you don't have that thermal capacity here. 3, the CPU will not be able to fully utilize its frequency or maximize its frequency while you're running and trying to do a mixed workload such as that. We'll try one last time here to fire up, now that this has been soaked with lots of heat, fire up Dragon Age Veilguard. We won't all tab out or anything. I don't want it to crash, but we'll demonstrate the same type of frame drops when the power level goes into half, and you get this very stuttery gameplay here. So as you can see, even now I resume, everything is stuttery. I'm getting very awful screen tearing and judder and just these flicker of the actual rendering engine. Not sure what happens here. Certainly driver related issues. At this point, the only thing you can do is quit the game and to relaunch it in order to resume pretty much standard or comfortable gameplay. So let's quit out of here. Alright, so here we are back in Dragon Age the Veilguard. So we just exhibited that the game crashes, the driver basically crashes, but you're still able to play the game. Your power levels get half to about 45 watts, and here we are. So right off the bat now we can see this very stuttery gameplay in here. We're getting about 45 to 60 watts. The CPU is right up there at 100 degrees Celsius. It's thermal throttling like crazy, and it's basically just a poor gameplay experience overall. Even though we're getting 60 watts of power to that GPU, and it's only at 80 degrees here. Now the CPU is consuming most of the power in the performance mode. So at this point, I'm not sure what has gone haywire. Is it the performance mode and the tuning that ASUS has done in the BIOS and Armory crate? I'm still running in the same mode. I haven't toggled any of the power levels or settings in there or switched performance modes. But after that GPU crash, things seems to go all over the place. The only way really to resolve this now is to reboot the device. So I'll be back in a moment here, reboot, and see if we can regain our frame rate, and particularly this very weird stuttering and screen tearing effect, which makes it almost unplayable. Because you can see here that this, when we're standing still, it shows it's about 70 watts, but realistically we're only getting about 40 to 50 watts of power to that GPU, and it's just an absolute stuttery and unplayable mess. So give me a moment, we'll reboot, we'll launch again in turbo mode, no messing with Armory crate settings here. We'll fire up our on-screen display, start streaming with OBS, and I'll show you how the gameplay looks in Dragon Age the Veilguard. Quick reboot, we're back in the game here. So this is Dragon Age the Veilguard, and we'll continue into the game here. We're running again in turbo mode. I've got all my monitors up. I'm currently streaming this over to YouTube, so we should be fully taxing the CPU and GPU as much as it's physically possible here. And we can see as soon as we start out here in this game, it's an absolute stuttery mess. So perhaps I'm trying to think that this is drivers related for this game itself. I was able to play thus far to the game without much issues, but at this point it's starting to become unplayable. As you can see here, immediately thermal throttling on that GPU down to about well, the power levels are truly all over the place, to be honest, but it's using more power on that CPU and of course that GPU. It looks like the combined budget for those is anywhere between 110 to maybe 130 watts. We're getting about 80 watts here on the CPU and about 30 watts here on the GPU. Sorry, 80 watts on the GPU and 30 on the CPU, meaning combined capacity here for thermal load and power of about 120 watts, roughly, more or less. And of course, when you add all the other components, you'll get closer to 200 watts here. So that said, this game is actually a stuttery mess. If we hop over to our, I hope this will not crash, you can see that I am streaming here with OBS. My mode here in Armored Crate is in turbo mode. And let's fire up our task manager. Yeah, so here we are. We can see that the CPU is more heavily utilized now, about 85%. Our RAM, the system RAM, 32 gigs, is about 88% as well. And if we look at the GPU here, the GPU's RAM of 8 gigabytes is totally being exhausted. We're getting about 70, close to 60 and 70% on the rendering engine. The video encode engine is lit up. We're also getting some shared GPU memory usage. So basically, this is as much as you can tax this device, and it's not able to cope. Of course, as I said at the beginning of this video, this isn't a typical workload or a typical use case that most of you would have. You can see now that the power levels are all over the place. It's just not able to sustain the gameplay at this level. What I'll do now, though, is I'll turn off the game streaming so we can see here what type of an effect that has when we're utilizing the GPU far less. So let's do that. We'll pause and let's stop the streaming here, and we'll exit out of OBS. OBS is a memory hog, so I'm not entirely surprised here. Perhaps I need 64 gigs of RAM on a laptop to be able to do streaming as well. Okay, so here we are. You can see here, as soon as I've killed OBS, I'm getting back a very respectable and a consistent frame rate. So this basically goes to show you that RAM is very, very much needed here. I'm actually quite surprised at how well this is running. It's nice and smooth. 80 plus watts. We're seeing dips here up to 100 watts at certain points. Let's take the zip line down. We'll turn the volume up a little bit here so you guys can enjoy some of the gameplay effects as I talk about this. And we'll quickly now sum up what I have to say about this laptop as I'm trying to fight these guys here. I'm sure I'm going to get wrecked. So basically, I think the takeaway here is that, you know, things can get quite heavy on this laptop if you're going to really push it to its limits. So make sure you understand what your use cases are when you're buying thin and lights particularly. And if you're doing anything except you know, gameplay or just dedicated streaming or any kind of content creation, you're gonna have a heck of a time here to try to use these thin and light form factors and get the respectable performance that you want. That said, though, if you're just gaming, I mean, look at this. This is a thin and light form factor. The noise level is totally under control. The surface temperatures are cool to the touch, and I've played like this for hours. So, you know, despite all the negative stuff that I've just shared and the downsides and considerations you need to take while you're going to consider purchasing this laptop, this is a fantastic formula. I would love to see the ASUS apply this to the a G18 or even a G17, and that would be much welcome, because that would give them extra capacity and extra space, volume inside the laptop itself to do perhaps even 4 fans, and, you know, cool them, larger fans that can cool spin quieter, slower, but actually draw more airflow across the surface of the device. You can see here that when I'm not streaming, this is a fantastic machine. And the same goes for content creation. As I mentioned, I've been editing 4K 200 megabits per second, you know, 422 video on this device without any issue whatsoever, and it's been able to churn everything out like butter. That 4070 is no slouch, but make sure you understand what is the capacity of your device, why you're buying it, and that's why an informed buying decision is so important. I hope I've demonstrated some very interesting facts here for you and basically showed you what happens if you take a thin and light device like this and push it to its limit. That said, I cannot praise this package enough. What they've been able to achieve here is simply stunning. This is under 4 pounds, easy to pocket, easy to transport. It gives you enough power to game, you know, pretty much any modern game here, with the exception of course, that VRAM limit. I hope that's something that NVIDIA will finally get over and give us 12 or even 16 gigabytes on the 47 mid-range models in the coming RTX 5000 generation. Right around the corner at CES here. We'll have to wait and see. But as you can see here, I'm getting respectable temperatures as well, under 90 degrees both on the CPU and GPU, 90 watts of power on that GPU here is giving us lots and lots of performance, and you can see I'm having a very enjoyable experience because of this OLED display. Everything looks absolutely stunning here. The visuals, the response time, there's no screen tearing to speak of whatsoever. I don't think you can beat this in terms of a thin and light laptop. That's why, despite all the laptops I review on my channel, I found this to be the best overall value, experience, and portability champion for 2023 and 2024. And with the exception of the Lenovo Legion line, which I absolutely love with its carbon fiber cover and its built-in liquid cooling loop, I think that was my favorite laptop of last year and of course of 2024 as well. However, the price on that says something versus what ASUS is able to achieve with this for, roughly half of the price depending on the specs. Of course, there's also a 4080 version available of this G16, which is much more expensive. I would caution against that. I believe 4070 here gives it enough power. If you do get the 4080 version, the Zephyrus G16 is my favorite laptop for a reason, and as you can see, I reviewed dozens and dozens of laptops. This was the one I chose for my personal device. However, I think I'll be moving on from this, perhaps to something new in the coming year. ASUS has hit it out of the park with this one. If you can find this at a deal with a 4060 or a 4070, I think you're going to have a fantastic time. Thanks everybody for watching. Like and subscribe, and please share this content to help the channel grow. We'll see you in the next video.